But how?
It's the adaptive unconscious at work again, picking up on those nonverbal cues, body language, tone of voice, all in those first 2 seconds, to give us a surprisingly accurate assessment of a person's character. And there's more. Gladwell also talks about these World War II code breakers.
Oh, I've heard about them. They could tell which German operator was sending.
Welcome to Witter. Who Has Time to Read? The podcast that brings deep dives for busy minds. Listen to AI hosts Jane and Dane and get ready to unpack the world's most captivating books in just a fraction of the time. Whether commuting, working out, or just squeezing in a quick break, we deliver key insights, thought-provoking themes, and takeaways you can carry into your day. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Plus, use our links in the description to purchase this book. Your support helps us bring more engaging book discussions to you. Listen and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Who has time to read? You do, with Witter.
All right, ready to dive in. We're tackling Malcolm Gladwell's Blink today. You guys sent over some intriguing excerpts from the book and a whole bunch of reviews, so let's unpack this idea of snap judgments.
It's pretty amazing how much our minds pick up on without us even realizing it.
Exactly. So where do we even start with this whole thinking without thinking thing?
Well, Gladwell starts off with a story about the Getty Museum, the one in L.A. They were about to buy this ancient Greek statue, a kouros it's called.
Oh, yeah, I think I read about that. Didn't it cost them a fortune? Like millions.
Millions is right. And get this, they spent over a year doing all sorts of tests, scientific analysis, comparisons with other statues, you name it. Everything seemed to check out. Totally legit.
So it was the real deal. What's the catch?
That's where it gets interesting. The Getty, like you'd expect, they wanted to be absolutely sure. So they brought in a bunch of art experts, the best of the best, to take a look. And several of them, almost immediately, something felt off. They had this gut feeling that something wasn't right.
Wait, really? So even though all the scientific evidence pointed to it being authentic, these experts were getting bad vibes. That's kind of spooky. What did they think was wrong with it?
That's the thing. They couldn't exactly say. One described it as intuitive repulsion. Another just straight up blanched when he saw it. One expert even said he felt a chill, like there was a glass between me and the work.
A glass. That's so strange. It's like their intuition was picking up on something that their logical minds couldn't quite grasp. Did they ever figure out what was so fishy about it?
Nope. The museum even had a big symposium, brought in all the top sculpture experts, and the more they talked about it, the more the skepticism grew. But they could never put their finger on exactly why.
So what's the takeaway there? Our gut can be wrong, even when we're experts.
It's more that our minds work on these two levels. Like the Getty experts, we've got this conscious analytical side, but then there's this unconscious intuitive side, what Gladwell calls the blink. And sometimes they're not on the same page.
That makes sense. It's like sometimes you meet someone and instantly get a bad feeling, even if you can't explain why.
Exactly. And get this, Gladwell ties this into this fascinating experiment called the Iowa gambling task. Have you heard of it?
Vaguely. It rings a bell, but honestly, I'm a bit fuzzy on the details.
Well, it's a bit complicated, but basically, people pick cards from 4 decks trying to win money. Sounds simple enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
But here's the thing. 2 of the decks are rigged. You might win big at first, but in the long run, you're guaranteed to lose.
Oh, sneaky. So it's a bit of a trap. What happens? Do people figure it out?
That's the fascinating part. After about 50 cards or so, most people start avoiding the bad decks, even if they can't consciously explain why. Their gut's telling them something's off.
Wow. So their intuition kicks in before their conscious mind can catch up.
Exactly. And it gets even weirder. They hooked up the participants to these sensors, and guess what? Their palms would start sweating when they hovered over the bad decks, a classic sign of anxiety, long before they were consciously aware that those decks were riskier.
Their bodies were giving them warning signs.
It's wild, right? It all ties into this idea of the adaptive unconscious, picking up on these hidden patterns and cues.
So are you saying we're all walking around with these supercomputers in our heads, constantly analyzing things we don't even realize?
In a way, yes. And Gladwell calls this thin slicing. The ability to find meaning in just a few moments of observation.
Like making a judgment call with very little information. But surely that can't be reliable for everything, can it?
You might be surprised. Gladwell talks about this psychologist, John Gottman, who can predict whether a marriage will last just by observing a couple for a few minutes.
Wait, seriously, just from a quick chat, how's that even possible?
Gottman spent decades studying relationships in his love lab. He brings couples in, they hang out, and he observes their interactions. And he's gotten so good at reading people that he can pick up on these subtle cues and predict with incredible accuracy whether they'll be together in, 5 years.
He's like a relationship psychic. So what, does he have people play relationship Jenga or something? What is he looking for?
He focuses on what he calls the 4 horsemen of relationships: defensiveness, stonewalling, criticism, and the big one, contempt.
So even a seemingly harmless argument about who's doing the dishes could actually reveal deeper problems.
Exactly. Like with the Iowa gambling task, our unconscious minds are constantly picking up on these subtle signs, even when we don't realize it.
Our brains are so much more complex than we give them credit for.
And this thin slicing isn't limited to relationships. Gladwell talks about a study where they showed people 2-second video clips of college professors teaching. Silent clips, just 2 seconds long.
2 seconds? You can barely tell if they're wearing pants in 2 seconds. What could they possibly learn from that?
Get this, the viewers rated the professors based on how effective they thought they were as teachers, right?
Yeah.
And guess what? Those snap judgments made by complete strangers after just 2 seconds, they were incredibly consistent with the evaluations the students gave those professors after a whole semester.
No way. Are you serious? So even our first impressions can be surprisingly accurate. But how?
It's the adaptive unconscious at work again, picking up on those nonverbal cues, body language, tone of voice, all in those first 2 seconds, to give us a surprisingly accurate assessment of a person's character. And there's more. Gladwell also talks about these World War II code breakers.
Oh, I've heard about them. They could tell which German operator was sending a message just by their Morse code style, right?
Exactly. Even if the message was exactly the same, they could tell who was sending it just from those tiny variations in their fist, their unique way of tapping out the code.
That's incredible. It's like recognizing someone's handwriting, even if they're trying to disguise it. But how did they even learn to do that?
It took a lot of practice, but they trained themselves to recognize the tiniest differences in the rhythm and timing of the code, those unique fingerprints. It's amazing how much our brains pick up on when we know what to look for.
That's amazing. It really makes you realize the power of the unconscious mind. But I have to imagine this thin slicing, as amazing as it can be, it must have a downside, right? What about those times when our gut feeling is totally off?
You're absolutely right. There are definitely pitfalls to snap judgments, times when our blinks lead us astray. And that's where Gladwell introduces the Warren Harding error.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Who's Warren Harding and what's so bad about his error? So this Warren Harding guy, he messed up big time because of a snap judgment. Spill the beans. What happened?
Picture this. The 1920 U.S. presidential election. Warren G. Harding, a senator at the time, ends up winning the presidency.
Okay, so what's the big deal?
Well, Harding's policies were nothing to write home about. His track record was, shall we say, questionable.
You're saying he wasn't exactly presidential material?
Not really, no. But here's the thing. He looked the part. Tall, handsome, booming voice. He fit the image many voters had in their minds of what a president should look like.
So it was all about appearances back then, too. Some things never change, I guess.
Unfortunately not. And it cost them. Harding's presidency is widely regarded as one of the worst in U.S. history, full of scandals, ineffective leadership, the whole 9 yards.
Ouch. So, the Warren Harding error, it's about trusting our gut based on superficial things, like how someone looks, even when the facts might tell a different story. But, come on, we're not making life-altering decisions based on looks alone in this day and age, are we?
You'd be surprised. Gladwell dives into this whole idea of unconscious bias, and it's more prevalent than you might think. Take height, for example. Even today, there's a strong association between height and leadership qualities. Taller people are often perceived as more competent, more authoritative.
Wait, seriously, you mean to tell me that taller people get ahead in life just because they're taller? What is this, middle school?
It sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, but studies show that taller people do tend to earn more over their lifetimes.
No way. So you're saying even if we consciously know that height doesn't determine someone's work ethic or intelligence, our unconscious minds might still be making those snap judgments? That's kind of unsettling.
It is a bit, isn't it? It shows how these implicit associations, these blinks, can operate below the surface, influencing our judgments without us even realizing it.
So is there anything we can do about it? Are we just slaves to our unconscious biases?
Gladwell argues that we're not powerless. We can learn to control these biases, to be aware of them, and make more informed decisions. He calls it mindful thin slicing.
Mindful thin slicing. I like the sound of that. So it's about finding that balance between trusting our gut and engaging our brains. It's like, think before you speak, but in this case, it's think before you blink.
Right. But how do we actually do that? Gladwell suggests a few strategies. First and foremost, awareness. We have to acknowledge that these biases exist within us, even if we don't like to admit it.
Okay, so step one. Admit that we all have these hidden biases lurking around in our brains. What's next? How do we actually change the way we make these snap judgments?
This is where it gets really interesting. Gladwell talks about this idea of priming. Have you ever noticed how just being exposed to certain ideas or images can subtly influence your thoughts or behavior?
I think so. Give me an example.
Like, imagine you see a bunch of pictures of elderly people. Without even realizing it, you might find yourself walking a bit slower.
Whoa, that's wild. So you're saying that our brains are constantly making these connections, whether we're aware of it or not.
Exactly. And by being more aware of what we're taking in, what's influencing us, we can start to recognize these biases and hopefully make more objective judgments.
That makes sense. So it's like we need to be more mindful of the information we're consuming and how it might be affecting our thinking, right?
Precisely. But there's more to it than that. Context is also key. The environment we're in, the situation we're in, it all colors our perceptions. Remember Kenna, the musician we talked about earlier?
Yeah, he was the one who got all that praise from the industry experts, but couldn't quite break through to mainstream audiences.
Right. And Gladwell argues that part of the reason his music was perceived so differently was the context. In a small, intimate setting like the Roxy, people loved him. But on the radio, competing with hundreds of other songs, it just didn't have the same impact.
So even if something's objectively good, the context can make or break it. That's a tough break for Kenna.
It is. But it's a good lesson for all of us. Our snap judgments aren't formed in a vacuum. They're influenced by a whole bunch of factors, some that we're aware of and some that we're not.
Okay, so we've got these blinks that can be accurate sometimes, sometimes not. They're influenced by our biases, by the context, by all sorts of things we may not even be aware of. So where does that leave us? Should we even trust our gut at all? Or should we just overthink every single decision we make?
It's not about choosing one or the other. Gladwell isn't saying that intuition is always bad or that we should never trust our gut. It's about finding that middle ground.
So how do we do that?
By understanding when each approach is most valuable. There are times when our instincts are incredibly accurate and times when we need to slow down and engage in more deliberate analytical thinking.
So we need to learn to recognize when to trust our gut and when to give our brains a little more time to catch up. Easier said than done, I'm sure.
It definitely takes practice, but Gladwell gives some great examples of people who have mastered this art of thin slicing. Experts in art, music, even food tasting. They've trained their instincts through years of experience. They've learned to pay attention to those subtle cues that most people miss.
So they're not just relying on some magical sixth sense, it's about practice and observation.
Exactly. They've studied their craft so deeply that their intuition has become incredibly sharp. But it's not just about blindly trusting your gut. They've also got this deep well of knowledge and experience to draw on.
They've got the whole package, the intuition and the knowledge to back it up. But not all of us can dedicate our lives to becoming world-class sommeliers or whatever. Is there anything us regular folks can learn from these experts?
Absolutely. One of the key takeaways is that these experts are incredibly observant. They've trained their minds to pick up on those subtle details that most of us would miss. And they don't rely on gut feelings alone. They're constantly analyzing, questioning, refining their understanding.
They're like the Sherlock Holmes of their respective fields, always looking for clues, always putting the pieces together. Okay, that makes sense. But sometimes even experts get it wrong, right? Like with that whole Pepsi challenge thing.
Ah, the Pepsi challenge, a classic example of how context can completely change the game.
Right. People loved the taste of Pepsi in those blind taste tests. But when it came to actually buying soda, Coke was still king. How do you explain that?
Because the sip test was an artificial environment. It didn't reflect how people actually drink soda in the real world.
So you're saying what works in a lab setting doesn't always translate to real life. That's a good point.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Pepsi's sweetness was great in a small sip, but over a whole can, it was too much. Coke, on the other hand, had this more complex flavor profile that was more satisfying over time.
So even though people genuinely preferred the taste of Pepsi in that moment, it didn't actually reflect their overall preferences.
That's so interesting. It's kind of like saying you love a band just because you heard one song on the radio, then you buy the whole album. It's like, what was I thinking?
Exactly. And, it's interesting how even those big market research studies can get things wrong if they don't consider the real world context. So how do we put all this together? How can our snap judgments be so accurate sometimes, like with the chorus, but then completely off in other cases, like the Pepsi challenge?
Yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling when you think about
It is. I think what Gladwell wants us to do is to be more aware of this tension, this back and forth between our intuition and those times when careful analysis is really important. Like with the Pepsi challenge, it reminds us that context is key. Just because something works in a controlled setting, like a taste test, doesn't mean it'll play out the same way in real life. Right, because real life is messy. There are way more variables. So where do we go from here? How do we reconcile this idea that our gut feelings can be both right and wrong?
Gladwell talks about developing something he calls mindful thin slicing. It's not about saying always trust your gut or never trust your gut, but rather know when to trust your gut.
Mindful thin slicing, I'm going to have to remember that one. So it's about being aware of those gut feelings, but not letting them completely dictate our actions.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance. And, a big part of that is recognizing that our blinks, those snap judgments, aren't always rational. Like with the Warren Harding error, sometimes our snap judgments are driven by biases, and those biases can lead us down the wrong path.
It's easy to get caught up in those superficial things, like how presidential someone looks, and forget to actually look at their qualifications. And it's not just about politics either, right? This happens everywhere.
Absolutely. That's why Gladwell encourages us to become more aware of our own biases. He talks about this test called the Implicit Association Test, the IAT. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, I think I took it online once. It's supposed to reveal those hidden biases we might not even know we have, right?
Exactly. Like you might unconsciously associate certain professions with specific genders or races, even if you consciously believe that those things shouldn't matter.
Right, like when you picture a surgeon, it's usually a man, even though there are plenty of amazing female surgeons out there.
Exactly. And while these implicit biases don't mean we're all secretly prejudiced, they do show how our unconscious minds can influence our perceptions. But the more aware we are of these biases, the better equipped we are to challenge them and make more objective decisions.
It's like we're shining a light on those blind spots in our thinking. So it's not about trying to completely eliminate our gut feelings, but about being more aware of how they work, where they might lead us astray, and how we can use them more effectively.
That's a great way to put it. And that's really what Gladwell is getting at with Blink. He wants us to think differently about how we think, to appreciate the power of our intuition while also acknowledging its limitations.
It's about recognizing that our snap judgments have a real impact on our lives and the lives of others.
And that with that power comes a responsibility to be mindful, to be aware, and to always strive for fairness and accuracy in our judgments.
Easier said than done, right?
Definitely. We all have biases, we all make mistakes, but the important thing is to keep learning and growing. And I think Blink gives us a lot to think about on that journey.
It really does. This deep dive has been amazing. We've covered so much ground, from the science behind snap judgments to the importance of context and even those hidden biases we all carry around. Gladwell doesn't make it easy for us, does he? He doesn't give us a simple answer or a 5-step plan. He just leaves us with this challenge to be more conscious of our thinking, even in those blink moments when we don't even realize we're thinking at all.
He certainly gives us a lot to ponder.
He sure does. And on that note, we'll leave you all to do just that. Ponder, reflect, and maybe even take a closer look at your own blinks. Until next time.